At the Jade Garden Studio in Kowloon, Hong Kong, on a Thursday afternoon in September of 1964, the air inside the training hall smelled of pine resin and chalk dust and the particular humidity that settles into a room when 40 men have been working hard for 3 hours without pause. The ceiling fans turned slowly above the floor. The windows along the east wall were open, and from the street below came the sound of a tram bell and the distant argument of 2 taxi drivers who had nothing to do with what was about to happen inside this building. 41 men were present. One of them did not know where he was standing. The man who did not know was named Robert Yuan. He was 29 years old. He stood 6 feet and 1 inch tall and weighed 253 pounds on the scale he had stepped onto that same morning, a number he had mentioned to 3 separate people before noon. He had been the heavyweight full-contact champion of Northern California for 2 consecutive years. He had trained under a former Korean military instructor for 6 years and under a Shotokan master from Osaka for 2 more. He had a reach of 81 inches. He had never been knocked down in competition. He had been invited to Hong Kong by a film production company that was scouting talent for a series of martial arts pictures, and he had arrived 5 days early because he wanted to watch, and to be seen watching, and to let people understand the kind of man who had arrived among them. In 4 seconds, none of that would matter. In 4 seconds, with one movement and no wasted motion, 135 pounds of concentrated clarity would teach Robert Yuan something that 8 years of training had not. And the 40 men standing in that room, every one of them a practitioner, every one of them credentialed in some art or another, would stand without speaking for 11 full seconds after it was over. Not because they were confused, because they were processing what they had seen, measuring it against what they believed was possible, and finding that their measurements were wrong. Nobody in that training hall knew they were about to witness something they would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe accurately. Stay with this until the end, because what Robert Yuan said from the floor, said quietly and without theater, would be repeated in dojos and film sets and gym corners for the next 5 decades. Robert Yuan had been in Hong Kong for 4 days when he first heard the name spoken with the kind of reverence that annoyed him. He had heard it in the lobby of his hotel from a pair of stuntmen eating lunch at a small table. He had heard it again at a restaurant in Tsim Sha Tsui from an older man with calloused hands who used the name the way people use the names of weather systems, as something that arrives without asking. He had heard it a 3rd time at a gym near the waterfront, from an instructor who stopped his own demonstration mid-technique to say the name and point in the direction of Kowloon as though pointing toward a compass bearing that mattered. The name was Bruce Lee. Robert Yuan had heard of Bruce Lee. He knew the general outline. A young Chinese American, an actor, a demonstrator, a man who had been on American television, who had appeared in a handful of films, who had developed a system of movement he called Jeet Kune Do, which Yuan had been told meant something like the way of the intercepting fist. Yuan had seen a photograph once in a martial arts magazine published out of Los Angeles. A slight figure, narrow shoulders, a jaw that looked too sharp for the face around it. He had noted the photograph the way a man notes a piece of furniture in a room he is passing through without stopping. What Robert Yuan had not done was watch Bruce Lee move. This was the gap in his understanding, and it was a gap wide enough to fall through. On the morning of his 5th day in Hong Kong, Yuan visited the Jade Garden Studio with a film production contact who had arranged for him to observe a training session. The contact had described the session as informal, open, a chance to see local talent working. Yuan had agreed because he wanted to be observed himself, wanted the people in the room to see how a 253-pound heavyweight moved, wanted to give them something to think about. He arrived in a pressed white training uniform. He wore a black canvas belt, He had combed his hair and cleaned his shoes. He walked into the hall and nodded at the men present and found a position near the north wall where he could see everything and everyone could see him. Bruce Lee was already on the floor. Yuen did not recognize him immediately. The man working in the center of the room was small, not slightly built in the way that suggests a lack of commitment. Small in the way that certain objects are small, the way a blade is small, the way the working parts of a watch are small, functional and exact and stripped of everything that does not serve a purpose. He was wearing a plain gray t-shirt, training trousers, no belt, no insignia, no marker of rank or affiliation. He was barefoot. He was working through a sequence of hand combinations against a wooden dummy at a pace that sounded like rain on a tin roof, and he was not breathing hard, and he was not performing for anyone in the room. He weighed 135 pounds. Yuen looked at him for 30 seconds and felt the thing that large men sometimes feel when they encounter small ones who have not yet learned to be afraid of them. A kind of patience, a willingness to wait. He should have waited longer. For the next 2 hours, Yuen watched. He watched Bruce Lee move through techniques with a precision that operated below the level of visible effort. He watched him demonstrate a concept to 2 students using only the distance between his hands, no words, just geometry. He watched him catch a training partner's kick in mid-air, not block it, not deflect it, simply close his hand around the ankle at the exact moment the foot arrived, as though he had reserved the space for it 3 seconds earlier. The room paid attention to him the way rooms pay attention to things that are operating correctly, quietly and without fuss. Yuen paid attention too. But he was paying a different kind of attention. He was measuring. He was calculating. He was doing the arithmetic of a man who is always won by weight and reach and power, and who looks at 135 pounds and arrives at a conclusion before he has gathered the evidence. At the end of the formal session, the room relaxed. Men drank water and stretched and talked in Cantonese and English and the mixed dialect that forms between people who share a physical practice. A tournament official named Wei Donghai, who had refereed competitions across 4 countries and who was present that afternoon as a guest of the production company, moved to the side of the room and set down his leather satchel and began writing in a small notebook. A filmmaker named David Shu, who had been shooting documentary footage in Hong Kong for 6 months, adjusted his camera on its tripod and considered the angle of the remaining light. A senior student named Marcus Chin, who had been training under Lee for 11 months and who stood 5'10" and weighed 190 pounds, rolled his shoulders and breathed out and waited to see what the afternoon would offer next. They were all present for what happened next. They would all be asked about it, repeatedly, in the years that followed. Robert Yuen walked to the center of the floor. He did not raise his hand. He did not ask. He moved to the center of the floor with the confidence of a man who has decided that the center of the floor is the appropriate place for him, and when he arrived there, he turned and looked at Bruce Lee and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, that he had been watching for 2 hours and that he had enjoyed the demonstration and that he had one question. The room became very still. He said the question was this: whether the techniques that looked effective against smaller training partners would hold up against a man who was built differently. He said he was not asking out of disrespect. He said he was asking because he had trained for 8 years and competed across 3 states, and he had never encountered a situation that preparation and size could not resolve. He said this plainly, without heat, as though he were presenting a logical proposition to a room of reasonable men. Then he looked at Bruce Lee and said, directly, that he meant no offense, but that he did not believe a man of Lee's size could stop him if he decided to move forward. He said he had 118 pounds on him. He said physics was not a matter of opinion. He was 29 years old. He had trained for 8 years. He had never been knocked down. He had just lost. He did not know it yet. If you want to hear what happens in the next 4 seconds, stay with this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from. This story does not end where most people think it ends. The room did not react. Not immediately. There was a specific kind of silence that forms in a space when a statement has been made that everyone present recognizes as consequential. And that was the silence that formed now. Wei Donghai, at the side of the room, stopped writing and set his pen flat on the notebook. David Shu did not move his camera. Marcus Chin looked at the floor once and then looked up again. Bruce Lee said nothing for 4 seconds. He was standing near the wooden dummy. He did not move toward it or away from it. He looked at Robert Yuan with an expression that several witnesses would later describe as perfectly neutral, which is different from expressionless, the way a mirror is different from a wall. He reached up and took the edge of his gray t-shirt between 2 fingers and adjusted it once along the collar, a movement so small and economical that it was almost invisible and that nobody who was not already watching would have seen. Then he said 2 words. "Come forward." That was all. No elevation in the voice, no gesture, no change in the angle of the body or the set of the shoulders. Come forward, as though he were indicating a place on a map. Robert Yuan came forward. He moved the way large men move when they have decided to demonstrate something, with deliberate weight each step placed to communicate intention. He covered the first 6 feet in 3 steps. He was 135 pounds heavier than his training experience had prepared him to respect. He was operating on a model of the world that was about to be corrected. At 4 feet of distance, he reached out his right hand. He closed it around Bruce Lee's throat. This requires precise description because precision is the only way to honor what followed. The hand was large. The fingers were trained to grip. The grip closed at the throat with enough force that a man of average conditioning would have been compromised immediately, would have felt the pressure on the vessels at the sides of the neck, would have lost approximately 40% of his available options in the first half second. It was not a reckless movement. It was technically competent. It was the best version of what Robert Yuan knew how to do. Second one, Bruce Lee did not pull back. This was the first thing that none of the 40 witnesses expected. A man of 135 pounds, seized at the throat by a hand attached to 253 pounds of forward momentum, and he did not pull back. He sank. Not fell, not stumbled, not retreated. Sank, a fraction of an inch, through the knees, through the hips, a movement so small and so immediate that it registered not as a response to the grip, but as something that had already been decided before the grip arrived. The weight transferred downward into the floor. The throat did not fight the hand. It became briefly irrelevant to the hand, which had expected resistance and found instead the specific quality of something that had simply ceased to be where it was. A fight is not 2 bodies in contact. A fight is a conversation about space, and the first thing you say in that conversation is whether you intend to occupy the space that the other person expects you to occupy. Bruce Lee's first word in that conversation was no. Second 2. The left hand came up along the inside of Yuan's forearm, not across it, not against it. Along it, traveling the line of the bone from wrist to elbow in a fraction of a second, a movement that coaches in 4 different martial arts would later attempt to recreate in slow motion from the description of witnesses and find that it required a level of precision in timing that they struggled to teach. The hand did not grip. It redirected. The 253 pounds of forward pressure, which had been aimed at a throat that was no longer precisely there, continued forward because physics does not negotiate. It continued forward along a line that had been altered by approximately 11 degrees. 11 degrees is a small number. Over 4 feet of distance, 11 degrees is the difference between where you intended to arrive and where you actually arrive. Robert Ewan's center of mass was moving forward at a rate his legs had not fully committed to yet. The redirect at the elbow told his upper body to continue while his lower body remained a fraction of a second behind. Wei Donghai, at the side of the room, set both hands flat on the table in front of him. He would say later, to 3 separate people who asked him, that he knew in that moment exactly what he was watching, and that knowing exactly what he was watching was the most disorienting part of the experience. Second 3. The right hand of Bruce Lee moved, not toward Yuan's face, not toward his chest, not toward any of the targets that Yuan's training had prepared him to protect. It moved to a point approximately 6 inches in front of Yuan's left shoulder, which was the point toward which Yuan's redirected momentum was now carrying him, and it arrived there and stopped. And the stop was absolute, the way a door stop is absolute, offering a surface against which traveling momentum must account for itself. Robert Yuan's own weight did the mathematics. His forward momentum met the stopped surface and converted. What had been lateral became rotational. His upper body turned. His feet, which were still engaged in the process of moving forward, could not follow at the same speed. The relationship between his upper body and his lower body became briefly adversarial. This is what falling looks like when it is designed rather than caused. It looks like the floor making a decision. David Shu, behind his camera, did not press the record button in time. He would say this with visible regret for many years afterward. Second 4. Robert Yuan was on the floor. Bruce Lee was standing. The distance between them was 3 feet and 2 inches. Bruce Lee's right hand was extended, not toward Yuan but beside him, at the height and angle of a motion that had been completed. His feet had not moved from the position they had occupied before Yuan began his approach. His t-shirt was in the same condition it had been when he adjusted its collar 4 seconds earlier. His breathing rate was unchanged. He had not thrown a strike. The room was silent for 11 seconds. Marcus Chin counted them afterward because he was the kind of man who counted things when he was processing information and did not know what else to do with his hands. 11 seconds. In 11 seconds, a great deal of ordinary activity occurs in the world. Traffic moves through intersections, sentences are completed, payments are made. In the training hall of the Jade Garden Studio in Kowloon on a Thursday afternoon in September of 1964, for 11 seconds, none of that ordinary activity applied. The room existed outside of it. Then Bruce Lee reached down with his left hand, the palm facing up, and offered it to Robert Yuan. The movement was unhurried. There was no performance in it, no commentary, no angle toward the watching room. It was a hand offered to a man on the floor. Nothing more. Yuan looked at the hand for a moment. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that has arrived in a place he had not prepared for it to arrive. Then he reached up and took it, and Bruce Lee brought him to his feet with a single motion that contained no more force than the situation required. They stood at 3 feet of distance, and Bruce Lee said something. He said it quietly. He said it at a volume intended for one person. The room did not hear the words. Several witnesses would say later that they tried to read the movement of his lips and could not, that the sentence was too brief and too quiet, and the angle was wrong. What they saw was Yuan's face receiving the words, and what Yuan's face did with the words was a process that took approximately 3 seconds and that ended in an expression that Wei Donghai, who had refereed competitions on 4 continents and who had watched men receive difficult information in public for 30 years, would describe as honest reckoning. Not shame, not anger. Reckoning This was the fork in the road. The men in the room understood this without needing it explained. A man who has just been taught something in front of 40 witnesses has exactly 2 available responses, and each of them leads somewhere different, and the choice is made in a matter of seconds, and the choice reveals the man. Robert Yuen made his choice. He looked at Bruce Lee and he said, loud enough for the room to hear, that he had been wrong. He said it plainly. He did not qualify it. He said he had been wrong about what physics could and could not do, and that he was grateful for the correction, and that he understood he had a great deal left to learn. He said the last part without bitterness. He said it the way a man says something true. Marcus Chin released a breath he had been holding since the second Yuen's hand closed on Lee's throat. Wei Donghai picked up his pen. The room began to breathe again. Bruce Lee turned and walked back toward the wooden dummy. He did not look at the room. He did not receive the moment. He picked up the thread of his work and continued it, as though the previous 4 seconds had been a parenthesis in an ongoing sentence, and the sentence still required finishing. Marcus Chin moved across the room as Lee passed and placed one hand briefly on Lee's shoulder as he walked. A light touch, the duration of a single step. The kind of contact that means I was here, and I saw this, and it was real. Lee did not stop walking. He acknowledged the touch with a slight adjustment of the shoulder, no more. The 40 witnesses left the Jade Garden studio that afternoon carrying something they had not arrived with. Not a story, exactly. Not yet. Something that would become a story only in the telling, and the telling would begin that same evening. In a restaurant on Nathan Road, where 6 of the 40 sat around a table and attempted to describe what they had seen and found that ordinary language was not quite fitted for the task. Wei Donghai told the story at a referee certification seminar in Tokyo 18 months later. He described the grip, the sink, the redirect, the conversion of momentum. He used a pen and a paper napkin to diagram the 11 degrees. The 40 coaches at the seminar listened without interrupting, which was unusual, and when he finished 3 of them asked him to repeat the part about the feet not moving, because they needed to hear it again. David Shu, the filmmaker, included a brief account of the afternoon in the production notes he filed with his company in 1965. The production notes were internal documents not intended for publication. They were shared informally among colleagues for years before excerpts appeared in a martial arts journal in the early 1980s. By that time, the account had acquired several details that were not in the original, as oral history does. In some versions, the grip lasted longer. In some versions, Yuen weighed more. In one version, there were additional exchanges. The core of it, the 4 seconds, the silence, the offered hand, remained consistent across every version, which is how you identify the true center of a story that has traveled far from its origin. The parts that do not change are the parts that were not invented. Marcus Chin taught his own students for decades afterward. He taught at a school in Oakland and later at one in San Jose, and he taught a version of the distance principle he had observed that afternoon. Taught it as a concept rather than a technique, the idea that a fight is a conversation about space, and that the first vocabulary available to you is not your hands, but your position, your angle, the line along which you choose to be present. He said he had seen this demonstrated once, by one man, in a room in Kowloon, and that he had been trying to teach it faithfully ever since. Robert Yuen returned to California in November of 1964. He trained for 3 more years in competition and then retired from competition and opened a school in Sacramento. The school operated for 22 years. Former students of that school have said consistently that Yuen began every introductory class the same way. He told new students that the most dangerous assumption a martial artist could carry was the assumption that preparation and size were the same thing as understanding. He told them this from personal experience. He did not always explain the source of the experience. He did not need to. The students who trained long enough eventually heard the story from somewhere. The way stories arrive when their time comes, and when they heard it, they understood why their teacher had started every class the way he did. Bruce Lee made no public account of the afternoon. He gave no interview about it. If he spoke of it in private, no record of that conversation has survived. This is consistent with everything else known about how he moved through the world. He did not carry the stories. He let other people carry them. And he kept moving. In a book published many years after his death, compiled from the notes and correspondence of people who knew him and trained with him, one passage addresses the quality of attention that made him what he was. It is not a dramatic passage. It describes the way he observed a training partner's movement before engaging. The particular quality of seeing he brought to the moment before the moment of contact. The way he read what was available rather than imposing what he had prepared. The passage ends with a single sentence that he was always more interested in what was true than in what he had previously decided. This is what Robert Yuen encountered in 4 seconds on a Thursday afternoon in Kowloon. Not power. Not speed, though the speed was there. Not technique, though the technique was exact. He encountered a man who had decided that what was true in this particular moment mattered more than anything he had prepared for it in advance, and the collision between that quality and Robert Yuen's 253 pounds of forward certainty produced something that 40 witnesses carried out of a training hall and distributed across 5 decades of dojos and film sets and gym corners and seminar rooms. There is a story a man tells himself about what he can do and what will stop him. And then there is what actually happens when those beliefs meet the specific conditions of a particular afternoon. Between those two things is the distance a man must travel to understand himself. That distance varies. For Robert Yuen, it was approximately 4 feet, and it took 4 seconds, and the journey was completed before he was aware it had begun. This is the thing that the room was processing during those 11 seconds of silence. Not the fall. The fall was physics. They were processing the gap between what they had expected and what they had seen, and measuring the size of that gap against their own understanding of what was possible, and finding the measurement uncomfortable in the way that only true things are uncomfortable, the way only things that require revision make themselves known. Next week, this channel will tell you what happened the evening Steve McQueen arrived unannounced at Bruce Lee's home and asked for a private lesson, and what he said when he left 3 hours later, and why he never spoke of it publicly, but why the people who were present never forgot what they heard. That story has never been told completely in one place. It will be told here.